The Alienation of the Self, Marx Polanyi and Ligottian Horror by S.L. Edwards. Marx and the Puppet, Alienation. Writing as the Industrial Revolution marked its smoking path across the Western world, Karl Marx remarked upon what he saw as the greatest horrors produced by capitalism and all its machinery. The system, as it was then, pulled forward and apart by coal, steel, and morbidly squalid working and living conditions, separated human beings from their fundamental humanity. He wrote, quote, "The increase in value of the world of things is directly proportional to the decrease in value of the human world." End quote. Footnote 1. Karl Marx, Alienated Labor, in Writings of the Young Marx on Philosophy and Society, page 289. End footnote. In Marx's view, as the worker is set to produce more things, and as these things increase in value, the worker loses value as anything other than a manufacturer of products. Footnote 2. Ibid, page 290. End footnote. As the products themselves are mandated, rather than determined, by workers' leisure or interests, workers are denied their fundamental creativity. Thus, they are bound to create things outside themselves, forced to birth unrecognizable and alien objects from their hands. Ultimately, Marx saw a labor force and a human race enslaved and ensnared by capitalism. What remained trapped in these chains was little more than a bipedal animal. Footnote 3, Ibid, page 292. End footnote. Similarly, Thomas Ligotti offers his readers puppets. Featuring prominently in the various hollow shadowscapes of the Ligottian portrait of this world, the puppets represent an idea that echoes Marx's prophecy of alienation. The puppets, too wooden and too smooth to be human, are tied by their strings. The strings bind them not only to their controller, but to their fundamental nature as puppets. And the Ligottian protagonist, or perhaps philosopher is more appropriate, looks down on them and sees something horrific. The puppets are not horrifying simply because they are animated, haunted with life where there should be none. Nor are they speaking, a sort of tried and true strategy by which writers make their dolls haunted and alive to invoke a fear of the supernatural, a fear that keeps us out of rooms with too many dolls, lest they speak. Rather, Ligottian fiction offers a very real fear of puppets in their fundamental reflection of what it means to be a human being, to be bound by strings and things. The puppet is a grotesque production of human effort, an all too successful attempt to understand mankind's lack of purpose against the bleak canvas of a wide universe where even the stars themselves are manipulated as, quote, bright puppets in the silent, staring void. End quote. Footnote 4. Thomas Ligotti, Dr. Locrian's Asylum, in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, page 223. End footnote. In this way, Ligotti adds to the horror invoked by Marx. The worker is alienated from their production, and by extension, from themselves. Marx writes that, quote, "The external nature of work for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but another person, that in work he does not belong to himself, but to someone else." End quote. Footnote 5, Marx, Alienated Labor, page 292. End footnote. This is particularly problematic for Marx, as labor is a fundamental part of human life and experience. He writes, quote, "It, that is, production and labor, is life begetting life. In the mode of life activity lies the entire character of a species, its species character, and free conscious activity is the species character of man." End quote. Footnote 6, Ibid, page 294. End footnote. If producing something through one's own hands and mind is a fundamentally creative effort, then workers are denied their very creativity. They produce not only something they cannot recognize, but something they cannot own, something they will never own. And because the laborer is an assumed person defined by creativity, and the labor which they perform is not for themselves, they do not own themselves. And if they cannot perform their own labor, nor define their own products, then it is by no means an exaggeration that they are not themselves. The laborer of Marxist thought, the product of the machine world of the Industrial Revolution, may look down on the Ligottian puppet and see its strings. They may see its too smooth features, its black and empty eyes. And because they have been denied their own humanity, we can venture that they might not see an alien product at all. For this worker, the puppet is an all too real mirror. They look upon a pallid countenance, an idiotic smile, and see a grotesque, three-dimensional self-portrait. A laborer, forced to produce things alien to themselves, will inevitably produce the puppet. And rather than being unrecognizable, the production and realization of the puppet are the manifestation of an unwelcome truth, the non-existence of the self, the self-delusion made manifest and physical. Polanyi, Ligotti, and the Town, the Satanic Mill. Karl Polanyi, writing in 1944 amidst the final days of World War II, in turn echoes Marx. His previous homes of Budapest, Vienna, and London had been burned and scarred by the war, one that he saw stemming from a single particular phenomenon. For him, both fascism and the radical communism of the USSR were part of a double movement, an attempt by governments to unfetter their markets while society drew away from them. Footnote 7. Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, The Political and Economic Origins of Our Time, 67 through 68. End footnote. Like Marx before him, Polanyi saw capitalism as containing contradictions which would ultimately be its undoing. However, rather than revolution, Polanyi's proposal is more modest, though no less complicated. Simply place the rules of the market back under those of society. Simply dispel the myth that markets had ever been separate from society. Famously, Polanyi asked a rhetorical question that begins his inquiry into the nature and history of markets as separate from society. Quote, "What satanic mill ground men into masses?" End quote. Footnote 8, Ibid, page 35. End footnote. His sweeping history of the Industrial Revolution and the preceding centuries outlines the slow, methodical process through which laws and society were changed to accommodate a new ideology of global economy. The result was the rise of poverty, pauperism, devastation of the countryside, and migration from it. Footnote 9, Ibid, page 35. End footnote. As for Ligotti, the fictional corporations that play a central role in some of his stories do not seem to fit the mold of an evil clandestine organization. Indeed, they often produce absurdly and horrifyingly nonsensical products, in which lie their horrors. Likewise, Ligottian fiction presents to readers not the corporation itself, but its ghosts, abandoned towns, industrial parks, the wreckage of globalism that has left Detroit a mausoleum of American manufacturing. Polanyi would say the pendulum of unfettered global markets swept like a scythe across these places. And indeed, it seems hard to argue against this. The graveyards made by corporations pockmark the Ligottian world, highlighting the temporary nature of mankind's endeavors. The Ligottian would add, however, that such transformation exposes not only a contradiction, but a futility. And this futility is not only placed upon capitalism. Indeed, all human activity and industry are conclusively useless. The narrator of The Small People, for example, notices this in the machinations of the puppet people who build their plastic miniature town. Their buildings are wobbly, their foundations weak. There is simply no way that a town, be it of plastic or brick, can withstand the forces of time. The seeming awareness of the futility of their actions gives the smalls more genuineness than their human counterparts. Footnote 10. Thomas Ligotti, The Small People, in The Spectral Link. End footnote. For Polanyi, unfettered markets were an engine of destruction, things to be recoiled from. The Ligottian would agree, but, as with Marx, would add a horror onto this conclusion. The satanic mill is not only a part of markets, but of towns and communities as well. And rather than grinding men into masses, rather than reducing them to puppets, it reduces them to the truth. The meaninglessness of activity only produces monuments to mankind's fear of a greater void. Towers and factories are only ineffective bulwarks against the blackness and wideness of the sky. Unfettered markets are certainly one engine of destruction, mechanisms that have accelerated destruction. But they are not the only satanic mills. These mills are woven into the very fabric of towns themselves, the lies of fictional communities and absurd corporations. And they do not grind men into masses, because a mass is as inconsequential as an individual. Rather, they simply grind mankind down into its truer nature, the keepers of its own expansive crypt. Ligottian clarity, a theme of great lies. The place where Marx and Polanyi would diverge from Ligotti lies in the core of his fictional and non-fictional conceptions of reality. Nobody is anybody. You are not your head. There is a conspiracy against the human race, a myth of meaning that serves to perpetuate the species' existence against the truth of meaninglessness. Only the demoralized can successfully acknowledge the truth. Anything less is a cowardly lie. Even in his grimmest writings, Marx offers a more optimistic tenor. Workers, so successfully ensnared by capitalist chains, only need break them. Polanyi, for his part, believes the ever-swinging pendulum of the double movement can be escaped if the lie of disembedded markets is exposed and acknowledged. The forces of capitalism can be subsumed and overtaken by social forces. Our priorities need only be realized. For the Ligottian, for the thoroughly demoralized, this does not matter. The truth of existence is that there is no reason for it, no justification. This is not to confine the Ligottian to a corner of inaction, or to place the Ligottian philosophy outside of, or deem it irrelevant to, politics. Rather, it adds a layer of horror to the author's and reader's interpretation of reality. One might be aware of this truth, and still go through daily motions, and still try to make the world better or more tolerable. But there is no utopia. There is only our bright puppet planet being pulled through the stars by unyielding strings, and to fight against these strings is futile and cosmically juvenile. Significantly, both Marx and Polanyi agree that there are great lies in place against humanity. Marx writes that, quote, "Theology explains the origin of evil by the fall of man. That is, it asserts as a fact in the form of history that it should explain." End quote. Footnote 11. Karl Marx, Alienated Labor, page 289. End footnote. In the same manner, capitalism explains itself as emerging from a primordial, fictitious state of nature. Mankind is made to believe that this simply is, and that it simply has always been. Likewise, Polanyi explains that perceptions of reality were completely rewritten to accommodate the brutal laws capitalism demanded. Poignantly, he writes, quote, "Man was forced to resign himself to secular perdition. He was doomed either to stop the procreation of his race or to condemn himself wittingly to liquidation through war and pestilence, hunger and vice." End quote. Footnote 12. Polanyi, The Great Transformation, page 88. End footnote. In order to explain the presence of extreme poverty alongside economic success, the desires of the individual and community were inexplicably connected. To explain a failure, one must tie it to the success of a greater society. Quote, "The individual should respect economic law, even if it happened to destroy him." End quote. Footnote 13, Ibid, page 89. End footnote. Marx and Polanyi both posit that explanations for reality, whether they be religions or laws of economics, were created on fickle and contradictory ground. The failure of mankind explains history, but there is no offered history of mankind that is not contingent on this explanation. Why has it failed? Because it simply has. Why does one starve while 2 neighborhoods over, houses throw away the food they cannot be bothered to eat before it goes bad? Because this is economic reality, carefully constructed over the course of centuries. The Ligottian philosopher protagonist of The Small People asks an asylum doctor how we could possibly know if some great reality-altering conspiracy was taking place. Quote, because we, mankind, have done it before. End quote. Footnote 14, Ligotti, The Small People, page 58. End footnote. To explain away things that ultimately undermine any lie of meaning, great lies and contrivances may be created and proliferated through a variety of doctrines and scholastic circles. This is a central recurring theme of Ligottian horror, that perceptions of reality are fictitious, misguided, and ultimately delusional. Though for the Marxist, chains can be cast off, and for Polanyi, markets can be subdued, this is not the case in the Ligottian world. For the Ligottian, the strings will never be removed. The vision of a better world is simply that, a vision. The better world is a dream, an apparition, and it is just as illusory as any other reality. What remains is to be pulled along by our strings. And as much as Marx might suggest we cast them off, or Polanyi that we take their reign, the Ligottian suggests that this, and indeed all of existence, is merely a contrivance.